white torture. It's difficult for me even to bring my words, but I'm assigned to do an introduction, so I have to. Welcome to Kunshal Trondheim. My name is Gulabedin Sukhanwar. I work at the House of Literature in Trondheim. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here in this seminar, White Torture and the Extraordinary Resilience of Narges Mohammadi, a prominent human rights defender in Iran. Narges has dedicated herself to fighting against acid attacks on women, advocating for the rights of women and minorities, and opposing the use of death penalty. A fight and commitment that has cost her a 30 years prison. We will hear more about the white torture from our distinguished panelists. So I will start introducing our panelists and request them to come on the stage. This seminar is organized by Transform Festival in collaboration with Amnesty International Norway, the House of Literature in Trondheim, and Kunshal Trondheim. Bueno, Asia, the word is yours.
Thank you. Welcome to the board. Thank you. The panel will be in two languages, Persian and English, and dear Farzaneh will translate and help me to continue. آقای رحمانی، من با شما شروع میکنم. اولا که خیلی خوش آمدین به شهر ما و ممنون که پذیرفتین در این پنل باشین. قبل از هر چیزی ما این فیلم تکان دهنده رو دیدیم و میخوام از شما در مورد خود این کمپینی که در مورد شکنجه سفید را افتاد، در مورد این در واقع زندان‌های انفرادی سوال بکنم، برای اینکه شاید برای بعضی‌ها هنوز سوال باشه که این چه هست و بپرسم، چون همسر شما به هر حال پشت این کمپین هست. اگر ممکنه با این شروع کنیم. I was asking him about the campaign against, the campaign against the white torture. As you see in the film, it was about the isolation cell, the solitary confinement. And we want to listen to Mr. Rahmani about the campaign that his wife launched it.
اول باید بگم که این اصلا تاریخ نیست، همین الان این وسیله یه وسیله شکنجه است، همونجور که نرگس هم گفت الان داره اعمال میشه برای کسایی که توی جنبش زن زندگی آزادی فعالن.
The first thing I need to point at is that this is not a historical event. This is something that is happening now to people who campaign for women life freedom movement in Iran.
ببینید اصلا این سلول انفرادی برای کشور برای مردم غرب زیاد قابل فهم نیست. شما سلولایی دارید به نام ایزوله که در اونجا طرف تلویزیون، روزنامه و همه چی داره. وقتی اینجا از انفرادی میگیم یعنی یه قبری که درش از روبرو باز میشه و شما با تنها کسی که میدونی صحبت کنی با جلادته.
When we talk about solitary confinement, it is we need to go back and think that this is a concept that is not familiar to the Western audience. Solitary confinement, as it exists in the Western world, is a cell, an isolated cell, where there might be TV, there might be access to newspapers, etc., etc. But when we talk about solitary confinement in the prisons of Iran, we talk about a grave, where the only door is in front of you. It is like being in a grave. And the only person, the prisoner who has been put in solitary confinement, have access to communicate to or talk to is the one who tortures him or her.
نرگس این کمپین رو با آگاهی شروع کرده. یعنی ما اگر بخواهیم دموکراسی و جامعه مدنی در ایران تقویت بشه، این روش شکنجه باید متوقف بشه. چون همونجور که در فیلم هم میگه نرگس، این روش جواب داده، هنوز و کارایی داره و باید باش مقابله کرد. پس باید همه دنیا به این کمپین بپیوندن.
One important thing for people like Narges, who has started the campaign against solitary confinement, is that this putting people in solitary confinement has been quite effective, as was described in the movie. And it is something that should be stopped by the democratic societies. And it is important that globally people would basically stand against the use of solitary confinement.
Thank you, Farzan Jan. Nazanin, I will continue with you. And first of all, we are very happy for having you here. And out of prison, out of Iran, with your family. Narges interviewed you. I am not sure that she interviewed you inside prison or outside, but you explain about your very special experience when they took your little girl, Gisu, and that was one of the most shocking narratives in this book, I think. Can you explain about what did you think? What was about your mind, your feeling, your hopes, your fears, and tell us about your experience in this kind of prison?
Sure. Can I just correct what you mentioned about my sentence was 5 years. I was kept in Iran for 6 years because I overstayed. I finished the sentence and then they did not let me leave the country for 1 more year. So in total, I was in Iran, in prison, and outside for 6 years. Just to correct that. So Narges interviewed me inside prison. I was in solitary confinement in the security ward of the Revolutionary Guard for about 9 months. And I was in between Tehran and a different city. For some reason, they transferred me from Tehran to Kerman, where the best part of the interrogations happened. And when I was transferred from the security ward to the general ward, that's where Narges interviewed me. I think it was about a week after I arrived. So yes, I had my daughter was not even 2 when I was arrested. And she turned 2 nearly 3 months after I was arrested. I think that solitary confinement is a kind of is a very quiet form of violence, because it tortures you and it dehumanizes you, it isolates you, and that is just for the function of solitary confinement is to break you, and that is how they use it to get information off you. And as we have seen recently in the new movement that has been happening in Iran over the past year, people are kept in solitary confinement for them to extract confession. And that is based on those confessions that they get lengthy years of sentence.
Why, Nazanin? Why? Because all torture can aim to this result.
This is my personal experience. So the solitary confinement is a cell which has no natural light, no fresh air. There is a door which is closed at you, and you can only leave this space if they allow you outside. Often you have 1 or 2 10-15 minutes of walks outside the cell. And it's very easy to think that the whole world's forgotten about you. That is the whole function of it. They keep you isolated for you to think that, oh, nobody cares about me. I didn't know that such a big campaign was running when I was in prison.
That was my question, that you know that various campaigns launched international and
idea.
within Iran.
No, I had, and I remember the days that I felt I was completely forgotten. And exactly the day that I was transferred from the security ward to the general ward, there was something going on in the ward. There was, I think there was the day that families could drop clothes. So there was a bit of a chaos in the ward. The people were just, getting their clothes and stuff. And I was sitting there, and Narges was the warden. So the ward had a person in charge who was also in charge of any newcomer. So Narges ran down, and I had no clue that they knew me. I was like, I'm like a normal, random prisoner. And I walked in, and Narges came through, and then she said, Salam Nazanin June, and then she gave me a hug, and I was like, do you know me? And she's like, yeah, we have been following your news. And then when I walked into the general ward, as she took me out to the ward, there were, I'm not really kidding, there were people all the way up to the staircase. They were waiting to see me. And that is like exactly 24 hours before that. I felt nobody knows where I am. Nobody knows what is happening to me, and everyone is just happily, carrying on with their lives, and nobody knows. And that is the whole function of it. That is the whole point, to make you feel you're forgotten. And I think that is how they can get away with it, and they can break you. And then they can get anything they want from you. So I think, for me, the main point was to hold on to your ground. And that is how, I think we will refer to that later, that's how, the value of talking about prisoners and telling their stories and letting them know in some ways that they are not forgotten.
During the non-month that you were in solitary confinement, didn't you anything about your daughter? Where is she? And
so my parents would bring her to see me nearly once every month. So I saw her about 5 or 6 times.
Okay.
But I had no idea that the whole world knows about my story. I thought that I am.
And Gisu was 2 years old.
She turned 2 when I was in solitary. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And we have Yum Pedereganas here, and we got aware that Amnesty International launched some various campaigns to help political prisoners in Iran. Especially, we have Nazanin here, and Amnesty had a campaign to support her case, and as well as Narges, we have a campaign to help her. And can you share about this process, how you can support them, and what's the results?
Yeah, I wish I could sort of just say, oh, we do this and we do that, and then people come out of prison. Unfortunately, that's not the way it happens all the time. I think our campaigning on behalf of prisoners, whether in Iran or elsewhere, has kind of 2 main aims. One is, of course, the main aim. Can we, in some way or other, hopefully and most often in cooperation with people in the country where we are trying to put pressure, and with pressure from other governments and all kinds of ways that we can think of, put pressure on the authorities who are keeping Nazanin, Narges, and others around the world in prison in order to have them released. And sometimes we believe that what we have done has contributed to that. You can never tell, because you'll never have a prison warden or a president or an Ayatollah come and say, yeah, we weren't planning to release her, but because you said so, we did. So, you just have to think, okay, hopefully that pressure did something. The other part is exactly what Nazanin said, is that more often than sometimes I'm really surprised how the message that somebody on the outside is actually doing something does reach people who are imprisoned. It could be just for once there was a sympathetic person working in the prison, or another prisoner has heard, and so I have to believe, because this is what I do all day, that in some way or another that does help. It doesn't necessarily get you out of prison, but the fact that in some way or other you're told that you're not forgotten, that gives you hope. And I've heard many stories from former prisoners that is actually sometimes bring people back from the brink of committing suicide, for instance. So that is basically Amnesty in a nutshell. We tried to get the information about people because some people are famous and many people know about them. Other people is a so-called normal person, but still experiences the same thing. So if we get the information on whether you're famous or not, we try to do the same, as long as we do no harm. In some instances, bringing up the profile of somebody could also do harm. So we have to do that kind of checks.
We know, Peter, that human rights activity inside Iran is a crime. We have some
but still, there are so
human
many
rights
brave people
defenders.
Who are doing it.
But how do you get the information from within Iran?
Well, as you know, Iranians are very, very sophisticated in using nowadays digital media and other ways of getting information out. There are, as you also know, still people who are organized openly or less openly, who are in regular contact with the outside world. Our people have their networks of contacts inside the country, the diaspora outside the country, who then have their networks. So, although we as an organization aren't let in, we can't travel in and do research on the ground. That would also be too dangerous for the people we spoke to. There are many, many ways in which we get that information, and also in many ways to confirm that information, not only accepting that some information from one person is correct, but to check that with other sources. Amazing. I'm not saying it's easy, because I'm incredibly impressed by my colleagues who actually do this work. But it is amazing what a lot of information they're able to get out. And that, to a very, very large extent, is because the people inside Iran are taking such enormous risks, and some of them, of course, end up in solitary confinement. I think you're going to leave me now. I just want to say something about solitary confinement, because I think it's important to know that sort of internationally, the UN, the European Council, every sort of intergovernmental organization that does anything regarding human rights does view solitary confinement over a very short period of time as, if not torture, then inhuman and degrading treatment. It is known that this is a way of torturing people, and therefore in 2015 the UN revised their guiding principles on the treatment of people whose freedom has been taken away, is basically what they say, but it's mainly prisoners. And they're called the Mandela Principles, and that's why I took up my phone, not because I'm desperately have to have my phone open, but I wanted to quote something, because these rules are called the Mandela Rules. Mandela is probably the most famous prisoner on earth. And they have very strict rules on when you can and cannot use solitary confinement. It has to be the last resort. It cannot be more than 15 days at the most. There has to be much more contact between the prisoner and, under normal circumstances, the people working in prison, because you're isolated from other prisoners, but you shouldn't be totally isolated. But the reason Mandela was particularly spoke particularly about this in his book, and I'll just quote him now. I'll quote the whole little paragraph around this. The rules restrict the use of solitary confinement as a measure of last resort, to be used only in exceptional circumstances. Mandela found solitary confinement to be, and here comes the quote, the most forbidding aspect of prison life. There was no end and no beginning. There's only one's own mind which can begin to play tricks. And this is what we have heard has been described, how this solitary confinement, and that also, I mean, Norway is criticized by the UN and by the European Council for using solitary confinement too often. And it's not used in any way close to Iran, and still we're sometimes criticized for using it so much that it could be seen as cruel and inhuman treatment. So then multiply that with 1,000 and you've got torture, of course, in Iran.
Thank you so much. You have actually answered the other questions as well. Thank you, Peder. Yeah, Mahnaz Jan, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You were in prison in 5 years in 1980s, and after a while, you became a lawyer for defending many political prisoners. Can you compare the two periods between 80s and the period that we hear listening about the news, we face to the news about prisoners and the campaign of white torture. در مورد دو تا شما هم در دهه 60 ایرانی میلادی خورشیدی ببخشید در زندان بودین و شکنجه شدین و هم بعد وکیل حقوق بشری شدین، از بسیاری از زندانیان سیاسی حمایت کردین، دفاع کردین. میشه این دو دوره رو با هم مقایسه کنین؟ چه تفاوتی وجود داره؟ What's the difference and similar? Yeah.
دهه 60 میتونم بگم اوایل دهه اول حکومت جمهوری اسلامی، زمانی بود که جمهوری اسلامی میخواست تثبیت کنه خودش رو و با گروه‌ها و سازمان‌های سیاسی پرقدرت که اونها هم مدعی در واقع قدرت بودند میخواست تصفیه حساب بکنه.
In the beginning, in the first 10 years, the first decade after the revolution in Iran, the Islamic Republic wanted to solidify its power. And they wanted basically to get rid of the other political fractions in Iran. So that was the first period you were asking about, Asiya.
Yeah.
بنابراین هر کسی که به عنوان زندانی سیاسی در اون دوره وارد زندان میشد یا هوادار این گروه ها بود یا از اعضای این گروه ها بود و امکان نداشت که شکنجه رو تجربه نکنه، چه شکنجه فیزیکی چه شکنجه سفید یا به قولی انفرادی، که انفرادی البته یکی از مصادیقشه.
So in that period, whoever who was imprisoned was a political activist of some sort, who was either someone who followed the principles of one of these political fractions, or was actually a member of that political party or fraction. And it was impossible to say that none of those who were imprisoned in that period did not put on some sort of torture, that torture being the usual type of torture, or being put in the solitary confinement.
البته در اون موقع هر دو نوع شکنجه فیزیکی و شکنجه سفید رو همزمان هم اعمال میکردن رو بعضی از زندانیان سیاسی. یعنی از این ور همونطور که نرگس در فیلم گفت زندانی رو میبستن به تخت، با کاب به کف پاش انقدر میزدن که پوستش شکافته بشه، گوشتش شکافته بشه و یا بیهوش بشه و تن بیجانش رو ببرن بهداری، و بعد یا اینکه با همون وضعیت زندانی رو میبردن به سلول انفرادی و درها رو به روش میبستن.
So it was not, of course, unusual in that period that prisoners were exposed to both types of torture. The physical torture, beating them, lashing them, and putting them into all sorts of torture measures, or and putting them in solitary confinement. As we heard and we saw in the movie, the physical torture was part of the treatment that the political prisoners got, but at the same time, it could be that they would be beaten up so much that they had to be sent to the hospital ward, so to say, of the prison for treatment, or whilst they were injured and in pain and all that, they would be put in solitary confinement.
Mahnouz, I want to ask you, if I can, did you experience this kind of torture yourself? I am asking because Mahnouz wrote a book about her experiences in prison, but I want to hear about this. Have you experienced yourself?
بله. خب برای اولین باری که منو بردن بازجویی در واقع زمانی بود که ماها رو توی سلولی انداخته، یعنی در واقع اتاقی انداخته بودن که مدت‌ها بلا تکلیف بودیم، هیچ ارتباطی با بیرون از زندان نداشتیم.
Yes, I experienced that type of torture. The first time I was interrogated during the first imprisonment and interrogation. That was when I had no access to outside, totally isolated. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I was totally cut out from the outside world.
منو بستن، یک سوال ازم کردن و نوشتن که به عربی که راه نجات فقط در اینه که صادق باشی. منظورشون از صداقت هم این بود که اون چی رو که اونها میخوان من تایید بکنم.
They asked me one question and they had written it in Arabic. And that was simply telling me, implying that the only way out would be to tell them the truth. And by that, they meant that I needed to basically confess to what they wanted me to.
اونها از من میخواستن که من تایید بکنم که من ضد خدام و ضد انقلابم و در واقع مقابل این دوتا ایستادم. به خاطر این الان زندانم. خودم تایید بکنم این مسئله رو.
They wanted these words out of me. They wanted me to say that I am against God, I am against the Islamic Revolution, so that I would put what they wanted out of me in my own words, give it as a confession.
خب منو بستن به یه تختی که از این تخت فنریا بود و دستامو از جلو کشیدن بستن به یه سر تخت، پاهامم از عقب کشیدن بستن به سر دیگه تخت و بعد یه پتو رو کردن توی دهنم و من نمیدونستم که این کارا چیه دارن میکنن و از اون ورم بازجو تهدید میکرد که به زور به ما چادر سرمون کرده، یعنی ما بدون چادر نمیتونستیم بریم بازجویی. تهدید میکرد که اگر چادرت بره کنار پدرتو در میارم و بعد یه دفعه من یه ضربه کابل رو به کف پام احساس کردم.
So what they did to me as an example of the torture I was exposed to, they tied me to a bed, my both hands on two sides from the head of the bed and my feet at the other side. And then they put a blanket, they stuffed a blanket in my mouth, and I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen. Then the interrogator, this is an explanation, further explanation for the audience who doesn't know what they do in prison. When they put women in prison, obviously they are not free to act and be the way they are, so they put this kind of, over covering the hijab on them, chador. They covered them from head to toe. So Mahnaz had this put on her. And then she was threatened by the interrogator that if this cover somehow if your head or if your hair or some parts of your body comes out of this cover and is showing, then you would be punished for that. And as I was in the middle of all this happening, then I felt the first whip on the sole of my feet.
البته یه اصلاحی بکنم، اولین باری که من شلاق خوردم بعد از اینکه اون برگر رو جلوی من گذاشتن و دیدن که من چیزی ننوشتم، به من گفتن بخواب رو زمین. اون موقع هنوز تخت‌ها رو راه اندازی نکرده بودن. به من گفتن بخواب رو زمین و من فکر کردم که اینها میخوان لابد شلاق بزنن به پشتم، چون ما نمونهش رو توی بندمون داشتیم و من نشستم به نحوی که اینجوری فقط پشتم آماده باشه برای شلاق خوردن. ادامه بدم؟
بله.
بعد گفتن نه دراز بکش. باز یه ذره من بیشتر خودم رو به زمین نزدیکتر کردم، یه لگد زدن و پاهای منم باز کردم و من درازکش شدم روی زمین. یه وقت دیدم که 2 تا جسم سنگین اومد رو پشت من. 2 تا مرد اومدن روی پشت من ایستادن و بعد به من گفتن پاهاتو بیار بالا و من نمیدونستم منظورشون چیه، اینا چی میخوان از من. به هر حال پاهای من اومد بالا، از زانو خم شد اومد بالا و شروع کردن به زدن ضربات کابل به کف پام. نه یکی، نه 2 تا، نه 10 تا، نه 20 تا اونجایی که دیگه من نمیفهمیدم دیگه چیه. یعنی اصلا دیگه نمیتونستم نه شمارش بکنم و نه میتونستم جلوی فریاد کشیدن خودم رو در واقع بگیرم. اونجا فهمیدم که چرا اون پتو رو میخواستن بکنن تو دهن من، برای اینکه خودشون از صدای زجه ها و فریادهای ما اذیت نشن.
I need to go back to the first time that I was beaten. I received the lashes. I experienced the lashing. This happened when they put the paper where I was supposed to basically confess to the things. When I did not sign the confession, then they asked me to lie down on the floor. Back then they hadn't yet brought in the beds that I mentioned earlier. So it hadn't become that complicated yet. So when they asked me to lie down on the floor, I thought that they were going to lash to use lashing, and they were going to basically do that on my back. So I sat, I squatted, and I presented my back. But then I was instructed that I need to lie down on the floor and I needed to basically stretch my legs and keep them wide open. And I didn't know what was the purpose of all these instructions. And as I followed the instructions and I did as I had been asked, I felt that the 2 very heavy things came and were on the top of me on my back. And these were 2 men who stood on my back. And then they asked me to lift my legs. I, again, didn't have any idea what they were asking me to do. So I did as I was asked. And then the lashing came, 10, 20 more. It got to a point where I couldn't count. I had basically lost the count of the number of lashes so far. And it got to a point where I couldn't stop myself from screaming out loud. And this is where the blanket, stuffing the blanket into the mouth of the prisoner makes sense, because they did that at a later stage so that they would not be experiencing the scream of the prisoner who is under the torture and lashing.
مهناز جان ببخشید، شما در واقع دارین شکنجه رو توضیح میدین. حالا میتونی بگی چه فرقی هست بین شکنجه و شکنجه سفید؟ What's the difference between the white torture and the torture that you explain?
بله، شکنجه خب الان من تعریف کردم آثارش میمونه روی بدن ما، هرچند که اون موقع انقدر فضا بسته بود، انقدر زندانیا ایزوله بودن، نه ملاقاتی با خانواده داشتن، نه به هیچ وکیلی اجازه میدادن که وارد زندان بشه و اصلا اون موقعیت رو و اون فضا رو و اون زندانی ها رو ببینه تا بتونه نشانه گذاری بکنه، تا بتونه گزارش بده، اصلا بره بیرون. ولی با وجود این به هر حال اون شکنجه آثار داشت رو بدن ما، آثارش تا الانش هم هست، یعنی تا الان بیشتر، الان دیگه 40 سال گذشته از اون سالها، ولی هنوز اثرش روی پای من هست، اگرچه به طور ظاهر مثلا آدم یه زخمی رو نمیبینه، اما اون اثر هست. اما شکنجه سفید اون اثر زخم و اون شکافتگی پوست و گوشت و خون و اینها رو نداره و در واقع با روح و روان زندانی کار میکنن.
The difference between the two types of torture, the physical torture and the white torture, is that when you are subjected to the physical beating and that type of torture, there would be a scar. You could see a wound. Although back then all these torturous activities and the whole thing was happening behind the closed doors. It was very isolated. The prison system, the news, it was not so easy for the news to come out. The lawyers, the advocates, they didn't have any way inside prison, so it wasn't so easy for even for the physical torture to come out as a news to the outside world. But nevertheless, the news would find its way out one way or the other. And the scars, the wounds, the things that you could see as a wound on a flesh, the blood was something that was visible for other people to see. Even now, after 40 years, having passed since I was subjected to that kind of torture, you could still see the scars of the lashing I experienced. But with the white torture, there is no visible wound, there is no flesh, there is no visible scar, no visible injury to the flesh. But what happens is that the soul of the prisoner gets tortured and scarred.
البته جمهوری اسلامی به این هم راضی نبود. همون موقع یه جعبه هایی رو ساخته بودن به ابعاد 80 سانت در 2 متر که خودشون به اون میگفتن تابوت. بعد زندانیا رو برده بودن توی اون تابوت ها مینشوندن، از صبح تا شب با چشم بند زندانی ها باید اونجا 4 زانو می نشستن در سکوت مطلق خودشون، یعنی از زندانی ها هیچ صدایی نباید در می اومد، حتی سرفه هم نباید میکردن. اگر که صدایی از زندانی در میومد با ضربات کابل هم مواجه میشدن. توالت رفتنشون به اراده زندانباناشون بستگی داشت. حموم رفتنشون هم همینطور، حداقل هفته یه بار بود. در اون فضا صدای رادیو پخش میشد از صبح تا شب که فقط از جبهه و جنگ و فداکاری ها و برای وطن و برای خاک در مورد پاسدارها پخش می شد. اینها می خواستند که زندانیا دچار عذاب وجدان بشن، شستشوی مغزی بشن و پوست بندازن. یکی دیگه از اهداف جمهوری اسلامی این بود که هویت زدایی بکنه از زندانی ها. همون جوری که عبدالله مومنی تو این مصاحبه در این فیلم گفت آدم احساس میکنه کثیف‌ترین آدم روی زمینه و اونها هدفشون همینه. کسانی هم که در واقع از همین زندانی هایی که در تابوت می نشستن نگهبانی میکردن و زندانبانشون بودن، خودشون زندانی هایی بودن که در اثر شکنجه پوست انداخته بودن، هویتشون رو به عنوان یه زندانی سیاسی از دست داده بودن و تبدیل شده بودن به یه زندانبان، شکنجهگر و جاسوس علیه همبندیاشون.
Excuse me, Manager, you should say shorter because she's, yeah.
Yeah,
She's writing.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah. Okay, so the thing is, what I explained about divide torture and its distinct differences compared to the physical torture, is that the Islamic Republic, the regime, was not even satisfied with divide torture. It would go beyond that. They had made, for example, these boxes that they themselves called for coffins, and the size, the dimensions of those boxes were 80 centimeters by 200, 80 centimeters by 2 meters. And they would bring the political prisoners, they would put them in the coffin, and they would put eye patches on them so they couldn't see anything. They would be kept there from day and night with the eyes closed in total silence. And they couldn't make a sound. They couldn't even cough. If they produced any sound, they would receive lashing. If they needed to go to the toilet for the toilet break, for taking a shower, everything was dependent on the will and permission from the prison guard. Imagine all that with putting the prisoners in the coffin and all that torture. In that environment, they would put on radio day and night things about the war, about the front line, about the sacrifices that the Revolutionary Guard was making, and so on and so on. This was to basically make the political prisoner feel remorse, get a bad conscience about what they were doing, as opposed to the Revolutionary Guards fighting for the country, etc., etc. This was aimed at basically trying to enforce a new mentality into the prisoner, make them change in the way that they would lose their identity. As one of the people in the movie mentioned, Abdullah Momani mentioned in the movie, what they do in that solitary confinement makes you feel that you are the dirtiest person on earth. And that is the real purpose of the solitary confinement. In the prison, there were some prison guards who used to be political prisoners being tortured. In the process of that torture and what they were subjected to, they would lose their identity and they would turn to what the regime wanted them to become. From the prisoner to a prison guard, to an interrogator, to someone who would torture, and to a spy.
We'll do kind in the second round, please. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mahnaz Jan. Wow. Masood Jan, you are a fighter for freedom of expression. You sat in the board of Swedish PEN long time, and you published many memoirs of political prisoners. And also you published a white torture book in Swedish and Persian, and Mahnaz's book. And I want to hear about how did you know Narges and why did you publish this book? How you supported the film that we showed here. Can you explain the process of providing these things?
خیلی سخت بعد از روایتی که مهناز کردم بخواد در مورد پروسه کتاب حرف بزنم، برای اینکه این روایت ها برای ماهایی که برای من که هیچ وقت زندان نبودم اما روایت های مختلف رو چاپ کردم، با گذشت زمان با اینکه 10 کتاب چاپ کردم باز هم در واقع اذیت کننده است. یعنی اینکه چطوری در واقع زندانی مهناز تونسته در واقع تحمل بکنه این شرایط رو و اونایی که نتونستن، اونایی که دیگه نیستن بین ما، در واقع این روایت های در واقع برای ما تعریف کنم. ما خب برامون خیلی مهم بود که این روایت های زندان رو منتشر بکنیم. همونطوری که گفتی از بین 100 روایتی که چاپ شده ما حدود 30 تا 35 روایت از زندان منتشر کردیم، از جمله نویسنده مشهور
شهرنوش که ترجمه شد.
ببخشید گفتین از بین 100 تا
شهرنوش پارسی پور.
نه، از بین 100 تا روایت چند تا؟
35.
35 تا و شهرنوش پارسی پور فرمودین. I need to begin with just saying that it is very difficult to explain about the process of writing, publishing the book, or making the movie after what we heard from Mahnaz about what she has personally experienced in prison. I have been involved in the process of publishing many books on torture and have heard many of these stories and testimonies from the political prisoners. But nevertheless, it is equally painful now listening to them. It pains even more thinking about people who have lost their lives in this process and are not here to tell their stories today. Going back to the question about the process of publishing the book, it was very important for us to document this, and we got lots of testimonies, and out of about 100 testimonies, we ultimately published 35 of them. One of them was the testimonies of, or the story, personal experience of one of the prominent Iranian writers, Shahrnush Parsipour.
شاید بد نباشه برای اونایی که شهرنوش پارسیپور رو نمیشناسن خیلی سریع بگم. شهرنوش پارسیپور یکی از مشهورترین رمان‌نویسای ایرانی هستش که رمان‌های زیادی نوشته. 4 سال و 7 ماه و 7 روز زندان بوده. هرگز عضو هیچ گروه و حزب سیاسی هم نبوده. چون از آزادی بیان دفاع میکرد اونو مجبور کردن که به مدت طولانی زندانی بشه.
For those who are not familiar with the work of Shahrnush Parsipour is one of the most prominent Iranian novelists with many publications. Shahrnush was put in prison for 4 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Shahrnush was not part of any political party or political fraction. Shahrnush's crime was believing and fighting for freedom of expression, and because of that, Shahrnush was put in prison.
به کتاب شکنجه سفید برمیگردم. قبل از تابستان 2020 از طریق یکی از همبندی‌ها و دوستای نرگس محمدی که بیرون از زندان بود این مجموعه گفتگوها رو به دست ما به نشر باران رسوندن.
I go back to the process of publishing White Torture, the book White Torture. Before summer of 2020, through one of friends, Narges Mohammadi's friends, we came to receive 12 testimonies of political prisoners.
خب این روایت ها وقتی دست ما رسیده بود خیلی مهم بود برای ما که اینا رو منتشر کنیم. تمام تابستان در مورد روش کار کردیم. چرا مهم بود؟ برای اینکه روایت های 12 زندانی بود که در زندان بودن. تقریبا همشون به جز نازنین اکتیویست بودن، در زندان بودن. دومی که کسی مصاحبه کرده بود که خودش سلول انفرادی رو تجربه کرده بود. سوم فوکوسش در یه موضوع مشخص بود، سلول انفرادی. و خب بخاطر همین ما برامون مهم بود که اینو سریع چاپ بکنیم.
It was very important for us to publish the testimonies because these were testimonies that were collected by Narges Mohammadi. These testimonies were collected directly from the social and political activists who were already in prison. All the testimonies were by the political activists, apart from the testimonies from Nazanin, who was put in prison not because she was a political activist. The second reason for this process and the publishing the testimonies being so important for us was that all the testimonies were based on interviews with solitary confinement as the main subject and as means for white torture. So we wanted to bring about the subject and basically introduce the subject, talk about that subject. The third reason was that all the interviews were conducted by Narges Mohammadi, who herself had been in prison. So she had a first-hand experience as a political prisoner. And the fourth reason was that the mere act of conducting the interviews and collecting the testimonies from the political prisoners in itself for us was by us was considered, and by all parties involved in that process, was considered as a continued fight for justice.
تفاوتی که در واقع به عنوان ناشر کتاب شکنجه سفید داشت این بود که ما تازگی کتاب معناز چاپ کردیم یا کتاب شهرنوش، ما میتونستیم در یه پروسه‌ای با هم دیگه گفتگو کنیم در مورد مشکلاتی که احیانا چه در با ویرایش یا چه خود روایت‌ها به بحث و گفتگو بشینیم. اما اینجا راوی ما در زندان بودیش، امکان تماسی باش نداشتیم که در مورد این روایت‌ها بتونیم روی برخی مشکلاتی که ما بهش رسیده بودیم توی متن‌هایی که داشتیم می‌خوندیم باش گفتگو بکنیم.
This process was a very difficult process, also because what we were trying to work on and the author of the book we were trying to publish was the subject of imprisonment and a prisoner who was in prison whilst we were going through the process. So unlike some other publications where we would have free and easier access to the writer, to the author, in this case, the author and the people who were giving us the testimonies were still in prison. And sometimes when we needed to go and verify the testimonies or when we had some practical questions about the testimonies themselves, it wasn't easy to say that we would easily access the source of the information.
Excuse me, I have a question. Because what you said is about the book, but providing the film was when Narges was out of Iran. And what was the relation with her and the team?
این پروسه خیلی آسان‌تر بود دیگه. ما بعضی که کتاب رو منتشر کردیم، خب 2 ماه بعد کتاب در واقع توجه ویژه‌ای گرفت هم بین ایرانی‌ها هم بین جوامع بین‌المللی. خب نرگس 2 ماه بعد از اینکه کتاب منتشر شد آزاد شد. توی پروسه نرگس تماس گرفت، اول از اینکه گفتش یکی از روایت‌هایی که از زندان فرستاده تو کتاب نیست. روایت 13 که ما چاپ اول همه رو جمع کردیم و دوباره کتاب رو منتشر کردیم با 13 روایت که مرضیه امیری در واقع حذف شده بود. خودش یه روایت خیلی خوبیه، به خصوص خیلی کالب و شکافی کرده زندانو. و بعد کتاب دوم در واقع اومد.
So after the publication of the book White Torture, about 2 months after that, the work got a lot of attention both in Iran and outside. And after 2 months, Narges was released from prison. And then we had direct access, so we could basically talk to her directly from October 2020 when she was released. After the release, she herself, Narges, took contact and told us that another testimony was missing. One of the testimonies was missing. The book had 12 testimonies, but the 13th testimony was missing. And that was one of the very interesting, very valuable of the testimonies. It's the testimony of Marzieh Amini, who has a very interesting take on the subject. She provided us with a psychological, analytical take on the solitary confinement and the experience.
خانم محمدی بعد گفتن که خب میخواد مصاحبه رو گفتگوها رو با زندانهای دیگه ادامه بده. خب ما بسیار استقبال کردیم و پیشنهاد ما این بود که من با یه تیم فیلمبرداری در ایران از سالها پیش تماس داشتم و خب از اونا خواهش کردم که همراه نرگس محمدی بره و همه اینا رو مستند بکنه و خب بیش از 100 ساعت در واقع این پروسه طول کشید. همه این مصاحبه ها فیلم شده، 16 تا گفتگو و خب ما یه بخشایی رو امشب دیدیم.
Taking on from the book, Narges Mohammadi, it was suggested that we conduct interviews with prisoners, and we would film the interviews. So together with Narges and a team of documentary filmmakers that we knew from before, we gathered about 100 hours of documented interviews that included 16 sessions, 16 interviews with the political prisoners, and out of that came the documentary that you watched a little bit of tonight in the beginning.
Thank you. آقای رحمانی, I want to return you, and your first answer was shorter than the others because you had an interview. But I have 2 questions now. The first is about you yourself. You were in prison, like the other stories, in 14 years. And we want to hear about your own experiences. But before that, I want to ask you a personal question, because I think that it is not easy to sit here and listening to many stories that your wife collected and published, and she's still in prison. I want to ask you first about your feeling now. Can you explain, please? 2 تا سوال پرسیدم، شما سوال اول رو کوتاه‌تر جواب دادین. سوال اول این هست که شما خودتون 14 سال در زندان بودین به عنوان زندانی سیاسی و میخوایم از تجربه خود شما هم در این مورد بشنویم، ولی قبل از اون میخوام یه سوال شخصی از شما بکنم. اینجا ما روایت‌های مختلفی رو میشنویم که همسر شما که الان در زندان هست اونها رو جمع آوری کرده. میخوام ببینم شما وقتی که اصلا در مورد نرگس ما میشینیم حرف میزنیم احساس شما چیه؟
این بیان این احساس ساده نیست. یعنی تو فکر کنی قسمتی از خودت تو زندان الان و تو نمی‌بینی که کاری بکنی که اون بیاد کنار تو. خب وقتی فیلم هم که نگاه میکنی این بیشتر خودشو نشان میده. خب این بیشتر از اینم برای من ادبیات نخوندم، نمیدونم زیاد رمانتیکش کنم، تو خیالم گاهی میکنم ولی زیاد نمیدونم. ولی واقعیت این است که وقتی که همسر آدم زندانه، انگار قسمتی از خودش، اون قسمتی هم که حساس داره توی تحت فشار هست. من الان 10 سال این حالت دارم.
it's not simple to put it in words how I feel. When you are in that situation, your partner is in prison. It's as if part of you is imprisoned. You feel incapacitated. You feel that you don't have any power over that. You are unable to change that situation that is so painful. Especially when I watch the movie, the feelings come more to the surface. I haven't studied literature. I'm not in that sense able to put it in a romantic way. But I can simply say that my wife, someone's partner, someone's wife, is as their part of their own existence. And I feel that part of me is in prison. This is something that I have been experiencing for 10 years now.
ما یه شاعری داریم به نام بابا طاهر عریان. خب یه جمله قشنگی داره، شعرهای قشنگی داره. میگه این جمله باشد شراب، میگه عزیز جونم امان از دست جدایی. این جدایی که حکومت به خاطر فعالیت‌های سیاسی یا اجتماعی بین زن شوهرها، خانواده‌ها میندازه، خلاص اثرات جبران ناپذیری داره.
There is this famous Iranian poet, there was this famous Iranian poet, Baba Tahir, and he once wrote, "Oh darling, alas, the feeling, separation, the feeling of separation." So what the regime is doing is to the political, the social and political activists is to put them through that pain of separation. And that has lasting effects on people who are involved.
خب ولی ما ناچاریم قوی بمانیم برای آزادی وقتی مبارزه میکنیم، ناچاریم قوی بمانیم. تجربیات خانم پراکند رو دهه 60 من خودم کشت بودم و همون کابل‌ها رو خوردم. هر شکنجه‌ای در هر دوره کارایی داره. دهه 60 اون کابل‌ها از انفرادی اثرش بدتر بود. ولی دوران جدید با توجه به نسل جدیدی که مبارزه میکنه، سلول انفرادیش اثرش از اون شکنجه ها بیشتره و تمرکز نرگس روی مسئله شکنجه سفید در حقیقت تمرکز یک نسلی است که مبارزه میکند و حس میکند که این شکنجه خطرناک است. نرگس در درون زندان انفرادی دچار فلج عضلانی شد و خودش این درد رو حس کرد و با دید حقوق بشری مخالفت با اعدام و مخالفت با زندان انفرادی برای پیشبرد حقوق بشر و حقوق زنان در ایران در کنار دیگر زنان به اصطلاح ادامه داد.
We have to stay strong. When you fight for freedom, you have to keep fighting and be going at that strongly. What we heard from Mahnaz about her experience from prison many decades ago with the lashing and with the torture, I experienced that in prison. I need to say something about what would work for the regime, what has worked for the regime during this time. Different periods have had their own different types of torture. When Mahnaz and I were in prison some decades earlier, it was the physical torture that had more effect than solitary confinement, and that was the dominant type of torture. But now in this day and age, with the new generation fighting, it is the solitary confinement that has become the main type of torture because it affects the prisoners more. And that's why Narges has concentrated her efforts to basically put the spotlight on this newer generation and what they are experiencing and what they are exposed to and what they are fighting for. Narges has experienced this herself in the solitary confinement. She got paralysis like in the solitary confinement herself, so she knows how this works. With her views about human rights, with her opposition to execution, with her opposition to solitary confinement, she is working along those lines to fight alongside others who fight for the same cause to bring about this issue with the solitary confinement and by torture to the public arena.
من هر دوشو دیدم، هر دو این نوع شکنجه رو دیدم. در اون موقع بازو وقتی که کابل رو میگرفت، کاب با سیم فرق داره، با شلاق هم فرق داره. کاب یه چیزی که به اسب میزنن یا به حیوانات میزنن و معمولا سیم برقه که از روش چیز بسته شده، پلاستیک رد شده. قطرهای کاب متنوع، انقدری هست، انقدری هست، انقدری. بازو میگه که تو نمره پا چنده، تو مثلا میگی 41، میگه میخوای 44ش کنم، 45ش کنم، یعنی انقدر کاب بزنم پات ورم کنه که تو دم پایی نره و بعد خون بیاد. این مال دهه 60 بود. دهه 70 میگه اینطور انداختیم تو این سلول که موهای سرت مثل دندانات سفید بشه، یعنی هر دوش در جهت فشار منطقه با توجه به شرایط.
Going back to different means of torture, having different, serving different purposes for the government at different periods, I experienced the two types of torture. Earlier in the 60s, well, it would be that 80s, in the 80s, it was the lashing with various types of cables. And when we are talking about cables, these are like electrical cables that come in different thicknesses. These are the types, these are not like a normal lash, if you like. These are the things that are used to lash an animal, a horse. And your interrogator, the one who was in charge of torturing you, would come to you and they would ask you, what is your shoe size? Is it 41? You would say it is 41. They would ask you, okay, do you want me to basically grow your shoe size from 41 to 45? Meaning that they would lash you so much that you would be inflamed and swollen and all that in your shoes so that you couldn't put the slippers back on. So this was in the 80s. In the 90s, it was putting people in solitary confinement. They would tell you that we would put you in solitary confinement so that your hair, the color of your hair would turn as white as the color of your teeth.
یه جمله میگم ولی همه این دردها برای رسیدن به آزادی از نظر ما میارزه. یعنی آدم برای اینکه به آزادی برسه میارزه که همه این دردها رو تحمل کنه. چون ما فرق انسان با دیگر موجودات به نظر من مشخص میشه.
But I need to emphasize that for me, it is worth, the fight for freedom is worth going through all the pain of the torture. That's where I can say that we differentiate from other beings as humans as opposed to other beings, the fight for freedom.
Thank you so much. Nazanin John, there are a lot of questions that I want to ask you, but because of the time, we have to. I want to ask you, I asked Aghay Rahmani about his wife in prison. And when you were in prison, all of us were amazed because of what your husband did. He stand, he resisted, and he demonstrated, he protested, and that was not just against the Iranian regime, but in Britain and for the British politicians as well. And I want to ask you, because you were in 5 years in prison, and but you were 9 months in isolation part, but you heard about this kind of campaigns. I want to ask you about how important that was for you, and how they brought hope for you and maybe for the other prisoners. And the second question is that you became an activist, and after prison, you were there because you were not a political activist there. You were a hostage in Iranian prison. That was important. That the stories of you is very different with the others. But now you are an activist, human rights activist. You write and you participated in such events or to support the other prisoners. I want to ask, how important is the support of imprisoned people inside Iran?
I just want to mention that I was not aware of the extent of what was going on to take me out. I only found out when I came out.
The whole 6 years?
I knew of the campaign, but I did not know the extent of it. There were many ways that prison, of course, as you know, there is very limited time you can spend on the phone when you're inside prison. The women's ward is very complicated. They have got very complicated phone system. And I think, as far as I am aware, they have got even worse now, that they have got very limited time. For the men's ward, they have everyday phone. They've got access to the phone. They've got like numerous number of phone booths that can use it. For women, there were only one for the entire ward. The capacity at the time when I was inside was 42 women could be in the ward. It is a small ward because it's the only women political female prison in Iran. But we only had one phone that we could all use. And even that phone was rationed. So every prisoner had 10 minutes every other day. So altogether 30 minutes. And the weekends we didn't have access to the phone. So there was very little I could get out through the phone. And by the time that my daughter was still in Iran, it was very hard to have a 3-year-old with you all the time and then talk about what is actually going on and what is my husband doing. So I knew through friends and news and sometimes the Iranian newspaper. So I could actually read through, somebody has come to Iran to talk about prisoners exchange through the Iranian newspaper, and had no idea, just because there was very little contact to the outside world. Of course, I knew that this campaign was going on, but I had no idea the number of people, and I was humbled. I was blown.
And I just wanted to mention that you told me before even the conversation that in many airports people know you. Can you tell that around the world people know?
Like I said, I am humbled. It is humbling. It is. It goes back to the same thing that when you are in prison, it is very easy to think that you're forgotten. It is part of the prison. You think that you're disconnected, and that's the whole function. And then you think that nobody can do anything about you, or nobody wants to do anything about you. I know for the fact that Amnesty has received so many letters. They never gave one single one of them to me. I never received any. And so many more had gone through the British Embassy in Iran, and they didn't want me to have access to them, so I never received any of the cards or any of the messages. Only one single time someone sent me a card, and it randomly came through the post in prison that some nice lady, no idea what she was called, don't remember the name, sorry. But then she was on holiday in Greece, and she sent me this letter from Greece to say, I'm thinking about you. And it was, and I remember she has printed some of the flowers that she had on that trip, just to show that, look, I saw them and I remembered, these flowers reminded me of you. And I remember for ages I had that card at the back of my bed and would show it to everyone. Look, there is someone in Greece thinking about me, not knowing that she's probably like one of many. What I was going to say was, I was in solitary for 9 months, but I know for the fact that there are many who have been in solitary for a lot longer. So we have Niloufar Bayani and Sepideh Kashani, who are currently in prison
Can you explain shortly that why they are in prison?
Yeah, so Niloufar and Sepideh are part of the conservationists. They're a group of 8 conservationists who have been in prison in Iran in 2016. So this is the end of their 6th year that they are imprisoned. There are 2 women and 6 men. And Niloufar and Narges Niloufar and Sepideh have been in solitary for nearly 2 years, for 23 months. To know that people go through all of that and they come to the general ward and they are normal people, it is magnificent. It is mind-blowing that, you know, we have the Baha'is, we have Mahvash Shahriari and Fariba Kamalabadi, who have served 10 years of imprisonment, and I had the privilege of being with them towards the end of their sentence, and then they have now been given another 10 years each. And they have gone through, I think, something around 2.5 years each of solitary confinement. As we go ahead, I'm just going to be very quickly pointing out that with the use of social media, a lot of awareness that people do talk a lot about people who are in prison. The Islamic Republic would want everyone to keep quiet. They would systematically tell people to shut up just because it is a form of intimidation. They would encourage them to, if you keep quiet, we will let you out. If you keep quiet, we will sort this out a lot quicker. In my opinion, if they arrest you, you just have to shout with your loudest voice ever, because if that is not going to, it might not get you out, but it certainly will not harm you. That is what I would say to people. There is a value in publicity and in campaigning, and that is reassuring for the people who are inside prison. So I know that people who are inside, the moment they know that people like us who are outside have been going through all of that, coming out, we talk about them. It's, you know, it's inspiring, it's encouraging, it's reassuring. Like you said, it will stop them through, you know, really strange things that might go through their head. But also, what I would do as an ex-political prisoner is just to be their voice and to tell their story. I think this is the least I can do. I don't claim that I'm a political activist, but I will do all I can to speak up about them and tell their stories. And I think this is the least we can do.
Thank you so much. And I just want to mention that fortunately we could inform inside prison that we will have this conversation here, and they know about this. And I have to thank you all to talk about this. And Peder, you said about the campaigns for helping and supporting political prisoners. But in the other side, we face to some real news there that, for example, execution increased in just for comparing 2 years in 2022 and this year, during just 1 year, more than 75% execution in Iran increased. And how do you explain this? And what can we do? What can we just end this violence, political violence, in not only prison, but in Iran?
Yeah, I'm sure there are other people here who could explain this better than me, but I think what we've seen in Iran sort of year on year is that even though probably the majority of executions are of people who have been sentenced for non-political crimes, such as murder, of course, the trafficking of narcotics, etc. the whole machinery of the death penalty and the executions is there also to scare everybody, to tell everybody what power the government has and what lengths they're willing to go. And that is, I think, the reason why there are more, the number of executions is going up in 2023 is exactly what happened 1 year ago in September, and then everything that happened the months following with the Women Life Freedom demonstrations and movement. So I think that is part of the death penalties and the executions are part of the machinery of suppression, the machinery of scaring people from going to the streets, as is the brutal way the demonstrations are being, or demonstrators are being shot, beaten up, imprisoned, executed. It's just part of a machinery of suppression. And I think it's possible to track that in Iran. You see that when there is a lot of resistance, there are more executions. And even though they're not, well, of course, this time around there are also more executions of people who are sentenced for political crimes. But normally it wouldn't have to be that. It's just, I think, the fact of showing that your life is in our hands. And we can do this to this person, but we could also do it to you. So how can we combat that? Well, it is in many ways, and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but the world is not necessarily going in the right direction, and which means that Iran is also, I mean, the regime, not the people, but the regime in Iran is also in a better bargaining position right now than it was even just a few years back. And unfortunately, I think that is mainly because of the Russian attack on Ukraine. So now they have a new friend. He sits in Moscow. They can sell stuff to him. They can get more revenue. They can broker that position vis-a-vis other geopolitical powers as well. And what happens and once again we've seen that, we saw that with the nuclear deal, is that geopolitically the outside world, not only the non-democratic but also the quote-unquote democratic part of the world, negotiates its own security and forgets about the Iranian people. So if there is gain to have in the sort of the global security area, they'll do deals with Iran, and they'll forget about what the regime is doing to their people. And that is what I think we also need to keep on saying. One thing is to keep on exposing the actual human rights violations, the brutal human rights violations that are going on, that the regime is guilty of, but also call out our own governments when they happily negotiate away the rights of the Iranian people.
Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes. Thank you. We have 10 minutes and question to you, and we want to have enough time to maybe audiences can ask you as well. Manoj, I wanted you ask about all these maybe could not happen if we had independent courts in Iran, or lawyers like you could help people, could defend political prisoners. Can you a little bit more, maybe not a little, explain about this? What do you think? What is the situation of defending political prisoners in courts and in prison? بله من ببخشید بله و محدودیت‌های وکلا مشکل
قبل از اینکه من به این سوالتون جواب بدم لازم میدونم یه توضیح کوچولو در مورد خیلی کوچولو میدم چون اینو خیلی به نظرم لازمه که بگم. یکی این که آقا تقی گفتن که اون موقع ایجاب میکرد که اونجوری شکنجه بکنن و اون جواب میداد. درسته. اون موقع فضا انقدر بسته بود و جوابم میداد و هر کاری دلشون میخواست میکردن. ولی بعدها که سازمان‌های در واقع جامعه جهانی و سازمان‌های بین‌المللی حقوق بشری توجهشون به ایران جلب شد اونها هم پیچیده تر رفتار کردن و بیشتر فوکوس کردن روی سلول انفرادی و تهدید زندانیا به تجاوز، قرار دادن زندانیا در کنار زندانیان خطرناک با احکام اعدام و تحریک اون زندانیا به ضرب و شتم زندانیان سیاسی در مواردی قتل زندانیان به خاطر اینکه پروسه اعدام اون در واقع زندانیان محکوم به قتل در واقع که محکوم به اعدام بودن عقب میافتاد.
ترجمه کنم.
Before I answer your question, Asiya, I wanted to just point at one thing that I think it's important to mention here. Mr. Rahmani talked about the different types of torture being used by the Iranian government, and that in the 80s they used a different type of torture, the physical torture. Yes, in the 80s they could do anything they wanted, more or less. But as things changed, the awareness in the international society and the human rights, the awareness was increased internationally, and then the Iranian regime had to change its tactic and focus on the solitary confinement. One of the tactics that they used was threatening the political prisoners, threatening them with rape, threatening them with various violent acts. One of the things that they specifically used against political prisoners was mixing the political prisoners, putting them together with the criminal, the ones who had been put in prison through the criminal courts, and basically making the ones, the let's say normal prisoners, basically making them go against the political prisoners, so that by basically making the chaos, disturbing the whole environment in the prison, they could hasten the process of execution of the prisoners, political prisoners.
فقط بسیار کوتاه لطفاً سوال خودتون جواب بدین چون سوالام
در واقع سوال خودم در واقع همون سوال پاسخ به اونه. و ما الان 13 تا زندانی مرد داریم که از زندانی که توش بودن در اوین منتقلشون کردن به قزلحصار و قرارشون دادن بین زندانیان خطرناک، جونشون در خطره. اینم مصداقی از در واقع شکنجه سفیده. به زندانیان بیماری‌های در واقع داروهای روان درمانی که هیچ شناختی نسبت بهش ندارن به زور و بدون ارادهشون میخورونن، در بیمارستان‌های روانی بستریشون میکنن، در واقع داروهای ناشناخته‌ای رو بهشون تزریق میکنن که آثار در واقع روانی بسیار وحشتناکی روشون داره.
Another form of the white torture that is now being used more and more by the regime is the example of, again, mixing the political prisoners with the criminals, so to say. 13 male prisoners have been basically transferred from Evin to another prison and put with the dangerous prisoners. Their lives is threatened, these political prisoners, and that is also one example of white torture. Another thing that the government is doing is that they are putting the political prisoners in the so-called psychiatric asylum, psychiatric hospitals. They are giving them injections by who knows what medications against their will, despite the fact that these people don't have an indication for receiving any of these so-called treatments, and by injecting them with these really unknown substances, they are endangering their health.
همه اینها به خاطر اینه که قوه قضاییه از استقلال لازم در واقع برخوردار نیست. قضاتی که در دادگاه‌های انقلاب نشستن و به پرونده‌های زندانیان سیاسی رسیدگی می‌کنن، همشون وابسته به در واقع نظام هستن. کسانی هستن که اصلا از قاضی در واقع غیر ممکنه شما بتونید از یک قاضی مستقل بشنوید که بگه که به متهم که شما مقابل نظام مقدس ایستادی. قاضی که رژیم رو مقدس تلقی میکنه، خب دیگه مشخصه که اون قاضی هیچ نظارتی نه بر پروسه تحقیقات، بازجویی ها و نه بر پروسه اجرای حکم نداره.
All this is happening because inside Iran there is no independent system for the judges. The judges are people who are basically the underdogs of the government, the vehicles for the government to put pressure on the people. There is no independence in the whole process. And how could one say that a judge is judging independently and without bias if they tell the political prisoners that what they have committed, the crimes, the political crimes that they have committed is against some sacred regime by just considering the regime a sacred entity. There is no supervision in the process in which through which people are arrested, they are interrogated, the cases are examined, and the court process or the execution of the sentences. There is no supervision there.
Thank you. Masood Jan, it's almost 1 year after killing of Mahsa Amini Jina and huge movements, women life freedom in Iran. And now we face that the governments have their economical and political relationships. What is about the people, how the global community can support the people and the movement in Iran, the civil movement, political and civil movement in Iran? What do you think about it?
تلاشی که ما میتونیم در واقع بکنیم، یعنی تحلیلی که من میتونم تو این زمینه بهتون بدم اینه که ما چاره‌ای جز رجوع به سازمان‌های مثل امنستی، مثل پن اینترنشنال، مثل خبرنگاران بدون مرز، نهادهایی که در واقع برای حقوق بشر کار میکنن نداریم. برای چی؟ برای اینکه افکار عمومی بسازیم. شما با یک دولتی روبرو هستید که هیچ قوانین بین‌المللی رو رعایت نمی‌کنه. من اگه بخوام از ته قلب بگم خیلی ناامیدی ویژه‌ای در واقع بهش رسیدم. یعنی فکر می‌کنم که جهان به طرف ناامنی داره پیش میره و بخصوص فکر می‌کنم بعد از این تغییر تحولات خاورمیانه و قدرت‌گیری انقلاب اسلامی و حکومت مذهبی ما با جهان خطرناکی روبرو هستیم و این آزادی بیان رو در همه جای دنیا همونطوری که تغییر دیشب تو برنامه گفت به خطر میندازید.
Well, after all that has happened in the political uprising and the recent changes in Iran and on the global level, my conclusion is that we have no other way than turning into the international societies, international institutions, and where the power lies, the power to support the movement. Organizations such as Amnesty International, PEN International, and so on, to put pressure so that the movement would be helped. The problem in the midst of all this is that the Iranian government does not uphold any kind of international law regulation as far as human rights are concerned. And I have reached a sad conclusion that we are in in a difficult position where it is difficult to see how the change would come about. With all the political insecurities in the world, with the religious, the fanaticism and radicalism being somehow on the rise, and the world becoming somewhat a more dangerous place, it is difficult to keep up hope. But at the end of the day, to reach any kind of hope, we need to fight, do not stop demanding an end to the arrest and torture, and fight for the movement, the Woman Life Freedom Movement.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. It's, yeah, we're done. Thank you so much.